Good morning. Nice to see you all here on this lovely day. Slightly different weather than we had, say, on, well, last weekend when you step out of the house and I was like, oh my goodness. Or Monday when we had that incredible thunderstorm. That was Monday evening when we actually canceled our sitting for the evening because the weather was so inclement. Or Tuesday morning when I got a telephone call right before I left the house and there was another thunderstorm and the power was out at Dartmouth Field. So this is a little more welcome, I think. So one question I have is something that has just sort of come up in conversations about what we do here at Dartmouth Field, but how many of you notice how quiet it is between the third sitting and when I walk into the room? Yeah, we were talking about this, and Jed was mentioning that, he noticed when he first came that he could hear himself swallowing. It was so quiet in here. And what's interesting about that silence is that I never got the instruction that that's what you needed to do. You know what I mean? It's actually not an instruction that you need to be quiet. So you can come in and go, Mary, how you doing? Nice to see you again, right? It's okay to do that, just to let you know, because it does get a little self-conscious, I think, in that silence. We're just sitting there. Should I be looking at anybody? Of course, say hi to your friends. Totally okay. We do learn those things. We just kind of go, nobody's talking. I guess this is the quiet time. When I first started teaching at it was before a community college. I was a TA, but I was in the English program. So that meant I was teaching classes. And my first class that I taught, so this is my first class that I taught. I walk into the room probably like 10 minutes before class, because that's when you could get into your classrooms. And the room was already full of students, and they're all staring at the front of the room silently. And I stood there for a while and I couldn't take it. I actually had to leave the room. That is what we call dukkha. So anyhow, just to let you know, you can feel free to greet one another. And, I was also reminded too, when we were talking about this, that when our friend Shokin Weinkoff, who's a teacher who teaches down in Iowa and actually started a monastery down in Iowa, when he would come up here, and he's going to be coming up again soon. Does he come? I can't remember. Is he coming up in October or September?
And October or November.
Oh, even that late. So October, November, Shokin will be here. One of the things Shokin would do is you kind of look out and he would recognize people and he would say, Roger, good to see you again. Good to see you again. And I was thinking about that I liked that when Shokin would do that. And I thought, if I did that here, I'd be saying that to everybody because I recognize all of you, but there are some new faces. Let's see if I can remember your names. It's Shannon and Zach. All right, Zach and Shannon. Everybody, if you haven't had a chance to say hi to Zach and Shannon, please do at some point. Make them feel at home. And Audrey, right? And Audrey. So is this your second time here or were you here? Okay, so your second time here, they were here last Sunday. And Audrey, this is your third time here? All right, third time here. So again, say hi to Audrey if you haven't had a chance to do that. We met both of these wonderful, or all of these wonderful people last week. So just say hi, make people feel welcome. And in that spirit, I was thinking about something that we started doing here in the spring, and I don't know if I ever gave a talk on this. I talked about this briefly in another talk. I know all this because I have all the stuff on file. You're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'll look at a talk that I gave 5 years ago. I can't do that. Don't remember that. I don't know why I think that's the case. But this talk I'll call Great Robe of Liberation. Does anyone recognize that phrase, Great Robe of Liberation? A couple hands raised, right? Mike, where have you heard that phrase before?
Ordination.
Ordination.
Yeah. Presentation of the role.
Right. So if you've been to an ordination, you've probably even recited that. Now, how about who sat here in the first two sittings this morning? So Andrew, where have you encountered that phrase before?
I have encountered it at the end of the second sitting on Sunday morning.
Yeah. So Mike, what we did is we recite that at ordinations, and we started, and I think it was this spring, we started reciting it after the second sitting on Sunday mornings. And the reason we did that is that it's actually traditional for monks to put their robes on after the second sitting of the day. So, and then they recite the verse of the case while they're putting their robes on. And well, what we do here at Dharma Field, because we're a urban center, we leave after the second sitting, usually. So I just thought it doesn't really make sense for us to do the chant of the robe and then have everyone put their robes on just to take them off again. And then I went, but wait a minute, on Sunday, a lot of people who, especially people who would wear their robes, they're here past the second sitting for maybe a third sitting if they're going to stay for it, but at least they'll be coming back for the talk and then for the social time afterwards. So here's an opportunity for us to be able to do this chant. One of the reasons I wanted to do, that I wanted to engage in this chant is that it's an interesting teaching. And a lot of what we chant in Zen are teachings. So they kind of help us to see what this practice is. And this little thing that we chant where we say great robe of liberation, this is the verse of the Kesa. And Kesa, K-E-S-A, or Okesa, is Japanese for kashaya, which is a Sanskrit word for robe. So the verse, the Kesa. And the verse of the Kesa is just one of these teachings. It has teachings in it that it offers. So I thought it would be nice just to do that. It's a little teaching that we have, a little 4-verse teaching that we recite every Sunday morning. And it's kind of nice to do. Unusual for people who haven't done it before. You know, I know we never really did that before that I remember. So when we first started doing it, I think it was a little bit of a surprise. So I just wanted to talk about this verse today, the verse of the Kesa, in part just to kind of help you see why it is that we recite this, but also just to remind people too why it is that you do see people wearing robes. And you go, well, Steve, I know what a robe looks like, and that does not look like a robe to me. That looks like a bib. This is actually something called a rakusu, and I will talk to you about the relationship of the rakusu to the Kesa in my talk. But anyhow, to talk to you also about why people wear their robes, and also just to make you aware that if you are interested, if this is something that moves you to perhaps take up vows to sew a robe, that is accessible to anyone who comes to Dharma Field. You want to talk to me about it, of course. So a lot of things going on in this talk. But for those who don't know this chant, the verse of the Kesa, it's just these 4 lines. Great robe of liberation, virtuous field, far beyond form and emptiness, wearing the Tathagata's teaching is the vow to save all sentient beings. That's how it goes here at Dharma Field. And we'll kind of intone it a little bit. Yeah, Roger.
I'm curious, when I sewed my rakusu, I was told always when I put it on, this chant, but it was I vow. So I'm curious how it doesn't here, it's is the vow instead of saying I vow to say also.
Oh, that's a great question, and I'll talk about that in a second. But one thing that Roger points out is that, so here at Dharma Field, with everyone present, we recite this, you know, after that second sitting. But you will also sometimes see me standing in a closet with my rakusu on my head doing this, because whenever we put that on for the first time, we have to recite the verse of the Kesa. We don't have to recite it, but it's what we do. It's a reminder of what it is we're doing when we put this rope on. So I appreciate your pointing that out. Yeah, and then I had been looking at Tomoe Katagiri's book on sewing the robe, and they have in there the version of the chant that you have, which is "I vow to save all sentient beings." And here at Dharma Field, we remove that "I vow to do things," because vow is, when you really realize what vow is, the I has nothing to do with it, so to speak. And yet it kind of does. Who else is making this vow? But when I make this vow, I'm doing it in a way that's not rooted in self. So there's a selfless I that's there. And I think our vow is the vow. Wearing this robe is the vow. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about vow as well. But that's a great question. So I'm just going to take this verse and go through line by line. It might not sound exciting, but there's some interesting stuff here. So I want to start with that line, great robe of liberation. Well, what is the great robe of liberation? That's it. It's this robe. It's this traditional patchwork robe of the Buddha, also called the Okesa or the Kashaya. Patchwork, you're going to find out why it's called patchwork robe, but that's what these things are known as. I'm going to tell you the story, the origin story. So those of you who read comic books, you've got the origin story of Dr. Octopus. Read those Marvel comics and there'd be this weird character and you'd be like, how did there get to be a guy who's got like 8 robotic limbs coming out of his body? Oh, here comes the story, right? And then you learn it because an octopus scared him I don't even know his origin story, to be honest, but we know how that works. Spider-Man got bit by a radioactive spider, that kind of thing. The origin story then of the robe. Now, I don't know that this is going to be the most gripping story in the world. There aren't any car chases in it, for example, but it's an interesting story. So the story goes that Buddha was in the kingdom of Magadha. We'll say Magadha. He was in the kingdom of Magadha. And he was at the capital of this kingdom, which is a city that he liked to go to. And in this kingdom, the king, Bimbisara, was a patron of Buddha's. So Bimbisara was traveling down the road and he saw what he took to be a Buddhist monk. And he wanted to pay homage to the Buddhist monk. So as he was getting off his elephant to bow in front of the monk. So just think about this. This guy's so committed to, respecting Buddha's followers that he's actually taken time to get off his elephant in order to bow before this guy. So as he's getting off the elephant, he realizes that this is not a Buddhist monk, but a Brahmin instead. And so you can imagine his frustration. It's like, I took all this time to stop my elephant, to get it to get down, and then I got off, and then I realized it wasn't even a Buddhist monk. So he approached the Buddha and said, can you come up with some way? Because right now your monks are wearing the exact same clothing that all the other religious practitioners in this area do. Can you come up with some kind of way that I can see that they're your followers? Maybe something that reflects your practice in some way? So Buddha started thinking about this, and one day he and his companion, one of his disciples, and suddenly I'm just having an old man, Ananda, one of those old man moments where you go, what's that guy's name? This is actually the first time I remember this happening. I'm a big film buff, and I love the films of this filmmaker. So I was sitting there going, oh no. I go, what is the name of that guy? And they were like, well, what guy? I go, he's the guy who, he directed Dr. Strangelove in 2001: A Space. I couldn't believe it was like eluding me that Stanley Kubrick's name was. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but if somebody forgets, at least this happens with my husband, if he forgets somebody's name, I forget it too. So then we're both sitting there going, okay, I know who you're talking about, right? That happened to me with Ananda just now. Buddha's great disciple, was Buddha's cousin, and apparently had this tremendous memory. So whenever we read a sutra, at least the way the story goes, the sutra is a teaching of the Buddha that Ananda remembered. So at least the myth is that all of these sutras are coming down from what Ananda remembered, this great memory. But anyhow, so he was a great disciple of the Buddha. And they were out in the countryside, and Buddha was looking out over the rice fields. And he was really taken by their tidy, orderly appearance that they have from those footpaths that go between the rice paddies. And then the rice paddies themselves, right? He was struck by how the rice plants in the paddies were, and I'm reading right now from this text. I should share with you what I'm reading, but the plants are growing together peacefully with other creatures without any discrimination, right? So I'm reading to you, by the way, this story is as is told by Tomoe Katagiri. You probably know the name Katagiri. Many of you do. Dinan Katagiri was the fellow who brought Zen to the Twin Cities. Tomoe was his wife, and she's still alive, 94 years old. Somebody told me she's getting up there in years. I said, she's not getting up there, she's past there. So she's 94 years old. But anyhow, she's a great sewing teacher. So she brought sewing practice not just to the Twin Cities, but she's one of the great sewing masters in the United States, one of 2 or 3 sewing teachers who brought this traditional type of sewing to the United States. And she wrote a little booklet that you can purchase from the Minnesota Zen Center for a donation. It's not for sale, it's just by donation. And it really explains how to sew the ropes. So there's a lot in there you probably wouldn't necessarily want to read. And I can tell you right now, you could look at those diagrams and you would not be able to figure out what on earth that diagram is showing you. I remember doing that, like kind of going, all right, I know that Bev, the person who was helping me do my first rakusu, I know she showed me how to do that, but I don't remember. I'll look at the book. And I looked at the book and I went, I don't know what in the name of heck that is. So, but anyway, but it has the story that I'm telling you in there. So yeah, Buddha looked and saw these rice fields. He saw the rice plants growing together peacefully and indiscriminately with other creatures. And so he told Ananda, design a robe that reflects these rice paddies, these rice fields that we're looking at. So Buddha was a traveling teacher, so he was out teaching. When he came back to this capital city of Magadha, he saw that some of his disciples were starting to wear these robes. And what the design that Ananda had come up with was to come up with a series of interlocking short and long pieces of cloth that were made from discarded fabric and then dyed. And the reason we have these kind of neutral colors like black and brown is that you had these sort of discarded fabric, this stuff that normally would be thrown away that people thought was gross. You know, they'd wash this stuff, clean it up, and then they would dye it so it was all the same color because it could be of all different kinds of colors. And they would sew it together. Nowadays, we don't so much use the discarded fabric. Though I know the sewing teacher in town right now, Fiona, see, there's my brain again. We'll just call her Fiona. But Fiona is a sewing teacher here, and she's interested in doing things like this. So she does make some robes that are from discarded cloth. And in fact, after COVID, she was seeing face masks lying all around. And she actually collected these face masks and then boiled them, got them nice and clean, and made a rakusu, and dyed them, and then made a rakusu out of discarded face masks. So that's what these things are, these little pieces of cloth that are sewn together. Inspired by these rice fields. And the thing about the rice fields, the thing about these robes and rakusus, is that they express something very deep and true about experience. So what they're expressing about experience is that experience always seems to have these 2 aspects to it. One is that there's all this stuff, all these separate things that seem to be appearing. And these things that seem to be appearing, they seem to come and go. So right now we're all here. Shortly, we won't all be here. You got some thoughts going through your head right now, like how long is this talk going to go on? And then you won't have this thought going through your head, right? So things are coming and going, but they always have these distinct edges. Oh, here it is, there it goes. Here it is, there it goes. There are all those things. Here is this in the classic Dermafield style. Here is this cup. Teachers talk about cups a lot here because they're right here. You point to the point. But whatever the things are, that's one way that it shows up. Experience, just as a bunch of different things coming and going. The other way it shows up is we're having this experience. Or we could just say experience is showing up. The experience of these things. These things wouldn't be appearing to us without experience, right? So there's just experience. There's always experience taking place. So it has these two qualities of different stuff, but it's all the same thing. It's all experience. This different stuff that's coming and going. It's all just this experience. So same thing with the different things that are showing up. So we have these different rice paddies. We have these different squares on the cloth. We have these different things that are showing up. It seems to be these separate pieces. But we realize when we start paying attention that these things can't really be separate. None of us, the totality, we'll just minimize the totality right now to this room. It would be different if you left. Now it would be a different totality, right? So we're all here. And you can start parsing that out even more and start seeing how everything is dependent on something else. You just do that thinking about the clothes you're wearing. You're wearing this clothes. What is it? Is it made of cloth? And is the cloth made of fabric that comes from a plant? And if it's made from a plant, well, how did a plant become this? Right, so we start thinking about how plants become cloth and then how cloth becomes clothing. And we start to see there's a whole lot that's involved. There's people that are involved. There's the soil that's involved to grow the plants. There's the rainwater. There's the nutrients in the soil. There's the sunlight. There's the fact that the plant wasn't killed by blight or something. So even stuff that didn't happen is showing up as the stuff that shows up. So we start to see, if we pay attention, that all these seemingly separate things are inseparable from one another. So everything that shows up is all totality showing up as this object. Everything. And it couldn't be otherwise. We wouldn't even perceive this without all totality showing up. Because what would it be? Well, we'll get into this when we talk about form and emptiness. So this is our robes then. And it expresses these two truths. We have just the robe itself, which is a separate thing. And then we can see that it is all of reality showing up as this robe. And the robe itself expresses that reality. Again, when you look at that field, it's a bunch of different pieces, but they're all the field of that robe. That's totality of the robe right there. And no piece makes sense without it being part of that totality. And that totality makes no sense without all the pieces there. If one of these squares is missing, it'd be a big hole in it, right? So it wouldn't be this totality. And yet, then the robe is also expressing, it's helping us to see that's the way it all is. It all seems like a bunch of separate stuff, but it's all just coming together. And so then we go, okay, that's the robe, but how is it liberating? That's how it's liberating. We start to realize that our experience is not limited the way that things seem to be limited. They have their duration, or they have their edges to them that help us to see them. It's not limited or bound, and yet it's still showing up right here in what seems to be limited and bound. And that's just liberating to realize that. So that we don't forget we've got these things here that are showing up, but they're expressing this aspect of experience of reality that we usually overlook, of this interdependence, and yet that interdependence depends on it showing up just like this. All right, so that's great robe of liberation, virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness. So now we have virtuous field. Well, what is virtuous? When we think about virtuous, we probably have ideas about that. Virtuous is, I looked this up in Webster's dictionary because that's my go-to dictionary. And it said morally excellent oh, morally excellent, you know, and again, we have ideas about what moral might mean, and then morally excellent, holy cow. And then you go, wait a minute, so what is morally excellent? The field? The field is morally excellent? What field? And then I would say this field. You go, but Steve, how can a field be virtuous? The way that a field can be virtuous is that it's aligned with reality. In Buddhism, when we talk about morality, it's about whether it comes from the whole. And that's moral behavior that doesn't come from selfish behavior. That's not about just serving me, my desires, or my fears, or to try to assuage my pain. But it's about seeing the whole situation that's arising and taking care of the whole, taking care of what it is that's showing up. That's virtuous. And so this robe is this virtuous field, right? It expresses reality. Not the idea of reality, but reality itself, which all things are expressing reality. Not the idea of reality, but reality itself. So this virtuous field, it says beyond form and emptiness. And you hear that and you start to go, okay, that's more Buddhism talk. I don't really know what that is. If you've heard those terms before, form and emptiness. Form is probably not that hard for us to understand what that's pointing to. Form is just whatever appears. And we can understand form really well when we're talking about stuff like this. We can see the form of this lectern. We can see the form of the cup or the chairs or the configuration of the room. We can understand that. But you know, sounds have a form to them. They have a shape. You notice when the jets are coming. I had one right at the beginning of my talk, right? And the thing that's interesting about that, when you sit, now I have tinnitus, and so it shows up a little differently than it would for some of you. But the thing is, suddenly there's a sound. It sounds like it does this. You know, so you're going, oh yeah, it's starts in this little and then it gets big, and you know, and it's kind of, that's the form it takes. But when that's the edge of that form, suddenly there's a sound there. And you start to hear it. So it has those edges. It comes and goes. That's form. Ideas are form. So ideas can kind of float through our mind. And again, they have beginnings and ends. And sometimes we just pick that same form up over and over. We go, all right, enough with the olives, right? And then you start talking, and then suddenly you've got the olives in your hand again, you know? Because maybe what happened was you had promised to bring olives to your friend's party, and you forgot to bring olives to your friend's party. And now all you can think about are those olives that you forgot to bring to the party. So you go, okay, I just am going to enjoy the party. No, I really can't believe that I forgot to bring those olives to the party, but come on, talk to Joe for a while. I can't believe it, you know, I know Joe likes olives. Now you're back with the olives again, right? So thoughts are formed too. And then what's this emptiness? Well, emptiness is a little harder to explain, but remember how we were talking about how every form is everything showing up as a form, including things that never happened. That's emptiness. That is emptiness. The fact that everything depends on everything else. So these seemingly solid things that we see really lack the way Steve Hagen, my teacher, talks about it. He calls it non-substantiality. These things don't have the substance that we ascribe them as having because they depend on everything else to be here. So this uniqueness is completely dependent on everything else for this uniqueness. So where's the edge to it exactly when you start looking at it? And there's another aspect to emptiness too. For there to be experience, this always has to be changing. Otherwise, you can't have the experience because it would always be the same. So every experience, I can't even snap my fingers fast enough to, you know, the experience we're having, every experience is change. And that's the only way we can experience. That's emptiness. That's insubstantiality, because we start to realize everything is interdependent and it's all changing all the time. We wouldn't be having experience if it wasn't that way. So that's form and emptiness. And you kind of go, well, they almost seem to be at odds with one another. So form is the stuff, and it's the stuff that's coming and going. But emptiness is saying, but the stuff isn't really stuff. It's really, that's my hand gesture of thus. It's thus. So we have a teaching, the Heart Sutra, that we recite. And it has a little teaching right at the beginning about the idea of beyond form and emptiness. Because I just told you form and emptiness, and they seem to be at odds with one another. But what this teaching really is virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness. So beyond that distinction we make between something and it being cosmically one with everything, right? Beyond form and emptiness is to not distinguish the two, but to realize, just as I was pointing out, you can't have form without emptiness. And we don't realize emptiness without form, because that's how everything's showing up. You can't have it otherwise. Can't be otherwise. So in the Heart Sutra, right at the beginning, there's this character named Avalokiteshvara. Mouthful. That's a mouthful. Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. In the greatest teaching on Buddhist wisdom, the main character is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Compassion and wisdom, inseparable. Without compassion, no wisdom. Without wisdom, it's not compassion. So Avalokiteshvara is meditating and is in samadhi, just single-pointed awareness, the realization of the fact that things aren't separated, and has this insight and shares it with another character, Shariputra, who's another bodhisattva, Buddha's first disciple, often considered Buddha's first disciple, very wise. So somebody who is well steeped in Buddhist wisdom. And Avalokiteshvara turns to Shariputra and says, "Oh, Shariputra, form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. That which is form is emptiness, that which is emptiness form." That's beyond form and emptiness. Realizing that the two are indistinguishable. And yet, there's form. And then there's this, so separate things. And then there's this, and yet they're inseparable from one another. Another teaching that we have in Buddhism is not two. So form and emptiness, not two. They're showing up as this, but not one. That's what it goes. It's not one either. This shows up as separate things, yet they're inseparable. All right, so that's virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness. So great robe of liberation, virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness, wearing the Tathagata's teaching. Okay, Tathagata. What is Tathagata? Tathagata. Zach, do you know what Tathagata is? Have you ever heard that before? Audrey, have you? Do you know what Tathagata? Have you heard that term? That's a weird one. And you'll hear it in Buddhist teachings. They'll just go, Tathagata, blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, okay, wearing whatever. Tathagata's teaching. Tathagata is Buddha. That was a name he called himself to help us to see that, what we're talking about in reality, that it shows up as coming and going, and that it shows up as always here, that it shows up as separate things, and that it's the whole. That's what Tathagata teaches us. That's what it points to. So it's a name that Buddha called himself to try to capture reality so that you weren't seeing him as a distinct individual. So Roger, getting back to that, I vow to save all sentient beings, to kind of get rid of that sense of the individual in front of you, but to put himself into this larger context. Tathagata is a portmanteau word. You know what a portmanteau word is? So a portmanteau is like a bag, like traveling bag. And a portmanteau word is when you take two words, you put them in the same bag. You combine them together. And so, of course, I'm preparing my talk and I'm going, now, what are some good portmanteau words? And then my brain did that thing where I was like, I can't think of a single one. So I just looked some up and suddenly I was like, oh yeah, there's a whole, there's a whole slew of them. Ones that we use a lot today. Well, one that has been around for a while, brunch, right? And I remember in The Simpsons, early episode of The Simpsons, there's a Frenchman that Marge Simpson is kind of getting the hots for, and they're out bowling. And he invites her out to brunch, and she doesn't really know what brunch is. He goes, oh, it's delightful. If you can imagine, I'm speaking this French accent. He goes, it's not quite breakfast, it's not quite lunch, and it comes with a side of cantaloupe. So brunch, blog, frenemy, which is a good one, guesstimate, these are all portmanteau words. That's what Tathagata is. Buddha joined a couple words together to create a new word that pointed to something that he couldn't point to with the words that he had at his disposal. Now, what two words he joined, that's what makes what he calls himself, really pop. Because it looks like he joins the word tata, which is Pali for thus, with gata, which means go or going. So going thus. In fact, you'll sometimes see Tathagata translated in English as thus gone one. So if you're reading through a sutra and it says thus gone one, you know that what they're translating is that word Tathagata. But it also could be the combination of tata and agata, and that's thus come. So now we have thus going, thus coming. Thus, we got the going and coming and going, the coming and going, that aspect of reality, and thus, it's always thus, it's always coming and going thus. There's this other aspect to it. And so that's why Buddha referred to himself as Tathagata, was to capture that, to capture, again, what experience is, what the world is. So wearing Tathagata's teaching, well, the teaching is this robe. And yet, when we don this robe, when we put this robe on, we can actually see what we're doing because we understand that this robe is both a separate thing and it's all of totality showing up as this robe. When we put this robe on, we're really just putting on, we could say, in a manner of speaking, putting on the mantle of thus, of totality. We're not shunning totality. We're just go ahead and we're putting it on. Our usual way of operating is we grab onto a thing and that becomes totality and we just blot everything else out. That's what we do. And that's what in meditation we can see that we do. We grab hold of objects to the obliteration of the rest of the universe and then think that that is the whole universe right there. And it is, but not in the way we think it is. So when we put on this robe, then what we're doing is we're not blotting out totality. We're accepting this robe, this separate thing, as an expression of totality. So everything that we interact with, every action we take is wearing the robe, is putting on, wearing the Tathagata's teaching. Every action we take is that. Every action is realizing the Tathagata's teaching, unless we don't realize the Tathagata's teaching. And even then, we're realizing the Tathagata's teaching. Whether we know it or not, we're always showing up like separate stuff. That's really an expression of the whole. That couldn't be expressed without the separate stuff because that's the expression of the whole. All right, so great robe of liberation, which, by the way, when we say it, I actually intone it a little bit, so it'll sound like this, just to take the weirdness out of it. Great robe of liberation, so it's got a tone to it. Virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness, and that's it. Wearing the Tathagata's teaching is the vow to save all sentient beings. That's the last one, is the vow to save all sentient beings. and I see something like that, and I tell myself, I fail over and over and over at that one. You know, the vow to save all sentient beings. Holy cow, who can do that? And I just want a sandwich right now. You know, but when I think that, when I think I'm failing again and again and again, that's just my mind. That's just me spinning out on my own thoughts. That's me picking up the olives thought and reliving that over and over again. Because what vow is just living this moment. So our traditional way of thinking about vows, it's something I'm going to do in the future. But Buddhism helps us to see that the future is just an idea. And Buddhism isn't about living out of your ideas. Buddhism is about living right now. Now that might require you live out of an idea of something, but Buddhist teachings themselves are always trying to direct you back to just now. So for Buddhism, vow is not something to do in the future. It's what we're doing right now. And I have this passage from Shohaku Okumura, a book that he wrote called Living by Vow, Living by Vow. And he wrote this. It's actually a very excellent book. He's looking at the Minnesota Zen Center, their chant book, which is very similar to our chant book. And he went, well, I'm going to write about these teachings. And so it's a book about the teachings that you find in these chant books. It's a very excellent book. But he wrote about vow. He says, a bodhisattva is a person who lives by vow instead of karma. Karma is kind of a loaded word, but Okumura explains to us what he means by karma. He says, karma means habit, preferences, or a ready-made system of values. As we grow up, we learn a system of values from the culture around us, sort of like the silence before a teacher walks into the room on Sunday mornings, right? We learn from the culture around us, which we use to evaluate the world and choose actions. This is karma and living by karma. In contrast, a bodhisattva lives by vow. Vow is like a magnet or compass that shows us the direction toward the Buddha. Where is that? Right here. That's it. So when I wear my robe, when teachers wear their robes, whenever we take up an action, that's putting on the great robe of liberation, we're actually vowing. Right now, this is vow. Everything we do is vow. We could be attentive to it or not, or we could do it not paying attention. But we're still expressing the whole, whether we like it or not, right? So I know I'm getting a little late here, so I'm going to wrap this up. Just tell you what a rakusu is then. So I told you that rakusu is robe. Oh, I should sum up what we just talked about then. So this great robe of liberation, virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness, wearing the Tathagata's teaching is the vow to save all sentient beings. I didn't even get to saving all sentient beings there, did I? We're putting on this robe as an expression of, an awareness of the fact that all separate things that are showing up are expressions of the whole, and that the whole shows up as these separate beings. And that realization is saving all sentient beings. Because if you realize that, what are all sentient beings but an expression of you? So in realizing that, all sentient beings are released, are liberated, because you realize they're not separate, they're you. So when we sit there and worry about, oh, how am I gonna save Shannon? How am I gonna do that? Well, the way you do that is you just realize the totality of this experience. You realize there's really not, there's separation, and yet that separation is just part of the picture. And so you just take care of this expression right now would be because of what I've done to you, Shannon. People are like, I sit and I talk to them, please don't bring my name up. You know, but it's just as we're, as I'm bringing you into the picture, now it's us. And that's actually the totality is the two of us, right? Showing up. So take care of that. Taking care of that is how you save all sentient beings. It's actually taking care of us. So we don't have to worry about getting around and messing around with other things. Other things are us. So just take care of what's showing up in front of you to the best of your ability, wholesomely. And that's what the verse is pointing out to us. And this, as I said, is a robe, a rakusu. In Tomoe's book, she says that these things came about in the middle of the 19th century in Japan. And she said the government and people simplified many things. So this is when the rakusu was created. Now, I do know that the story is actually, it's unclear when rakusus actually were starting to be used. Because another story that I had heard, and I found this on another talk, somebody shared with me a talk on this very verse that I'm talking about today. And that person said that rakusus probably emerged, but we're not sure, in China. And I'd heard this before, that, in China, this I do know, Buddhism was persecuted for a while. So kind of Buddhism had to go underground, so to speak. And so the robes were miniaturized. And what this person says is that people wore their robes then under their clothes. So they had the robes on, but they weren't visible to anybody but people who could see that they were wearing this under their clothes. So. And then Dogen, who's a Japanese master, 13th century, who brought Zen that we practice to Japan from China. He saw these robes and he brought the robe practice to Japan. And then my understanding is that over the centuries, it went fallow again until Kodo Sawaki in the 20th century, another great teacher, but he saw somebody wearing these robes. He didn't know what the heck they were. What are you wearing? And so the traditional robes again became part of the practice. So, as I was preparing my notes, I had a longer section in here that I put as I was preparing it, optional, and I'm glad I did because it's 10:02 right now, which is a little long for a talk. So I do apologize for that. Thank you for your patience. So I'll just end my talk there. I think I've said enough. Yeah, Roger.
I sewed with her on this category, and so to bring out that she wanted, there were like 8 sections, something, in Saturdays. And she said, she told us, this is a serious business. While you're sewing, it's like you're doing zazen. And the standard was very high. And so she wanted you to know that as you sewed, it's not like joining the Boy Scouts or something. You are taking up a new way of life. Yeah. And she would go around the tables, the card tables, and pick it up. I never saw her smile during this whole time. She'd pick it up and sometimes just kind of shake her head. And her hands moved faster than you could see them. And she would just rip it out. And particularly, I was allowed, it's the first sewing I ever did in my life. Somebody else at my table was great at sewing. She just pick it up and go. And so, it's, but there's no laughing, talking, no talking. Yeah. Just like a zazen period. Yeah. So by the time you got done, at the end, what she did for those of like retarded sewers, he'd just come around and in minutes finish the whole rakusu. Yeah. She'd just go around and, but in the end, you couldn't go through that with her without realizing you're in a different life from now on. Before you even got to the ceremony, sewing the rakusu, this is not it. I keep it at home. Yeah. This is one that I bought, but it was just like becoming a Catholic priest or something. You were not the same person afterwards. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story about Katagiri. To be honest, what you were just talking about, that's the part of my talk I cut out. It was about the sewing part of it. Yeah, the first time I ever saw in my life, because I'm not a sewer either, stitch remover or whatever they call those things, was when I was doing it. Yeah. But that's great. And, as far as that, being somebody else, really what we're starting to do is realize who we really are. So it's letting go of that sense of self. And so you think about those stitches, and Katagiri was coming along, Tomoe was coming along, taking those stitches out like that. It's helping us it might have taken,
For me, that might have taken me like hours to have done that. And she's just gonna, in a, what you said, it's almost like an eye blink, remove hours of work. And guess what I would have done? I would have invested, I would have identified with the work that I would have been like, she's doing that. And that's great. Great teaching. Because that's what we do. We do some of them, we go, look at what a good guy I am. You know what I mean? Like, and we need to see that we do that. It's not that that's wrong. It's just that is what we're doing, and that is what's leading us to be confused. And then confusion arises suffering. So you go, well, Steve, suffering sounds bad. That sounds like a wrong thing. It's not. Suffering is part of life. Suffering will arise. We have to realize that's part of life. That's Buddha's teaching, the first teaching. We use the word dukkha here at Dharma Field, but it's often translated as suffering. Suffering. There is suffering in this world. That is the nature of this world, of this and that. So yeah, I appreciate your sharing that, because that's, you take every stitch, you also recite. Did you do a little recitation with every stitch? I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Buddha.
Yes, supposed to try to do.
And there are thousands of stitches in robes. I can't write, I calculated once, because this is how my brain works. I counted how many stitches are in a square, and I went, okay, I have this many squares and this many sides. And so I think I came with 10,000. It was something like that. Times you say, take refuge in the Buddha. And that's a vow. Again, brings you back. Because when you're doing little work like that, it's easy to do two things. To go, see, what was the song that I was singing there? I just went, oh no, I know. I went to a concert on Friday night, and the song Messin' with the Kid was in the concert. So those of you who are of a certain age and remember the Blues Brothers, it was a popular Blues Brothers song. And that song was going through my head all. So you could be singing going, call it what you want, but I call it messing with the no. Take refuge in the Buddha. It keeps you from doing that, or doing this other thing where you're like, it's neither getting totally sucked up in it nor being lost. It's just being present with each stitch. So yeah, I appreciate those stories, Roger. Any other comments or questions?
I have a question, Steve.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, in some Zen communities, when somebody takes the precepts, part of that is also sewing a rakusu. Here at Dharma Field, they're kind of two distinct activities. Can you maybe speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are two different ceremonies, and most, I kind of looked this up. It's a great question. I looked this up to try to figure out what the distinction was. But we have two ceremonies. One is called Zaika, and the other is called Jukai. And Jukai is where you sew one of these. This is where you're taking lay ordination vows. So to me, it's just a sort of a level of commitment. When you take lay ordination or priest ordination, you're really going to be taking up some responsibilities. As Katagiri put it, we're just reading Returning to Silence. Priest is a filter. And priest's job is to be a filter, and that filter is to always come back to the ultimate nature of reality. And so we talk about our practices, take up what is wholesome, end what is unwholesome, purify the mind. That's that filtering that Katagiri is talking about. And that's when you take the vows like Jukai ceremony or priest ceremony, you're really taking the responsibility to do that. The precept ceremony that we do that doesn't have the sewing is a more sort of secular vow to live this way. So they're really all vow to live this Buddha way. It is when you take lay ordination or priest ordination, there are some responsibilities that come along with it that a secular vow doesn't necessarily have. But we all have the responsibility to take care of this moment. So really it's that. And some of it has a more kind of formal flavor to it. But does that answer your question? Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a great question. Anything else? Great, thank you for your attention.